esteem. Let's start at the beginning, because this is where it almost always begins, not with cruelty, not with confusion, but with intensity, with magic, with fireworks, esteem. And that's why it's so hard to see clearly. When you first meet this person, it doesn't feel ordinary. It feels extraordinary. They don't just like you, they adore you, esteem. They don't just want to see you, they want to see you every day. They text constantly, they call you their soulmate within weeks. They say things like, esteem, I've never felt this way before, or where have you been all my life? And part of you feels chosen. Special, finally understood. Now here's the thing, esteem. Healthy relationships can absolutely start with excitement. Chemistry is real, but love bombing is different. It's not just enthusiasm, it's escalation, esteem. It moves at a speed that doesn't allow for discernment. Before you've had time to observe patterns, values, or character, you're already emotionally invested, esteem. They may talk about future plans almost immediately, trips, moving in together, marriage, children. They create a shared fantasy before there's a shared foundation, esteem. And because it feels so affirming, so intoxicating, you may override your internal alarm bells. If you've ever thought, this feels a little fast, esteem. But maybe I'm just scared of intimacy. That's a moment worth pausing on. Love bombing is powerful because it meets deep human needs. We all want to feel seen. We all want to feel desired, esteem. We all want to believe someone recognizes something extraordinary in us. A narcissistic partner studies you quickly, your vulnerabilities, your dreams, your insecurities, esteem, and mirrors them back to you in a way that feels like destiny. They become exactly what you've been looking for. But notice something subtle. The intensity is about possession, esteem, not partnership. It's about securing admiration and emotional control early on. The faster you bond, the harder it is for you to leave later, and there's often a sense of urgency. Esteem. They might say, I just know when I know, or why wait when this is real? If you ask for space, they may interpret it as rejection. If you slow things down, they may escalate the charm. Big gestures, expensive gifts, constant validation. It feels flattering until it starts feeling overwhelming. Here's where the psychological shift begins, esteem. When someone places you on a pedestal this quickly, they aren't seeing the real you. They're seeing an idealized version of you, one that reflects well on them. You're perfect, amazing, esteem, flawless until you're not. And that's important because that pedestal has a trapdoor. Love bombing creates emotional dependency. You get used to the constant affirmation, the attention, esteem, the intensity. Your nervous system acclimates to that high, so when the devaluation starts, and it often does, you don't just feel hurt. You feel withdrawal, esteem. You start chasing the version of them that existed in the beginning. And many people tell me, but it felt so genuine. Of course it did. It often feels completely authentic in the moment, esteem. Narcissistic dynamics are not cartoonishly obvious. They are seductive, they are persuasive, they are convincing. The question isn't whether the early affection felt good, esteem. The question is whether it was proportionate to the amount of time and knowledge you had about each other. Real intimacy builds gradually. It unfolds through shared experiences, esteem, through conflict resolution, through seeing each other in different contexts. It doesn't explode into existence overnight. When someone falls in love with you before they truly know you, esteem, what they're falling in love with is an idea. And when you inevitably reveal yourself as a complex, imperfect human being, that's when the cracks begin to show, esteem. If the beginning of your relationship felt like a fairy tale written at lightning speed, if the intensity outpaced the intimacy, esteem. If you were swept off your feet before you had time to stand steady, that's not romance. That's a setup. Because healthy love grows. It doesn't overwhelm. Once that intense beginning settles, esteem, or more accurately, once you're securely attached, something subtle starts to shift. And this shift is quieter than love bombing. It's not fireworks, it's erosion, esteem. It's the slow realization that somehow everything is about them. At first, you may not notice it. You're still riding the high of how special they made you feel, esteem. But listen carefully to your conversations. Pay attention to what happens when you share something important. Maybe you had a hard day at work. Maybe you're excited about an accomplishment, esteem. Maybe you're struggling with something vulnerable and tender. You begin to speak, and within moments, the spotlight shifts. They interrupt. They one-up, esteem. They pivot the story back to themselves. If you talk about being exhausted, suddenly they're more exhausted. If you celebrate a success, esteem, they subtly minimize it or redirect to their own achievements. If you express pain, the conversation becomes about how your pain inconveniences them, esteem. And here's what makes this dynamic so confusing. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's polished. Sometimes it's wrapped in charm. They may appear engaged, nodding, maintaining eye contact, esteem, but the emotional reciprocity just isn't there. You leave conversations feeling oddly empty, like you were present for their performance but not truly heard, esteem. Healthy relationships have emotional exchange. There's a rhythm. You speak, I listen. I speak, you listen, we respond to each other. But in narcissistic dynamics, the rhythm becomes one-sided. Esteem. You become the audience, the supporter, the validator. Your role is to reflect their importance back to them. Over time, you may start shrinking parts of yourself. You might think, esteem, maybe I'm talking too much. Or, maybe my problems aren't that big. You begin filtering your needs because expressing them feels pointless, or worse, it triggers irritation. Esteem. Empathy is the key piece here. Real empathy isn't just saying the right words. It's the ability to sit in someone else's emotional world without hijacking it. Esteem. And that's profoundly difficult for someone entrenched in narcissistic patterns. Your feelings may be acknowledged briefly, but they aren't truly held. In fact, esteem. Sometimes your vulnerability becomes ammunition later. You share an insecurity and confidence, and weeks later it's used in an argument. You open up about a fear, and later it's mocked subtly. Esteem. That teaches you something very quickly. It's safer not to share too much. Another sign everything revolves around them is how they react when they're not the center of attention. Esteem. At social gatherings, do they dominate the room? Do they become irritated if the focus shifts to you? If you receive praise, do they go quiet, withdraw, or suddenly create drama? Esteem. Attention is their currency. When it's not flowing toward them, tension rises. You may also notice how much emotional labor you're doing. You regulate their moods. Esteem. You anticipate their reactions. You soften your words to avoid triggering defensiveness. You become hyper, aware of their needs while yours quietly go unmet. And here's the painful part, esteem. You may start believing that if you just explain yourself better, love them harder, support them more consistently, things will balance out. But this isn't a communication glitch, esteem, it's a structural imbalance. The relationship is organized around their ego, their needs, their validation. When conflicts arise, notice how quickly the narrative flips. Esteem. You bring up a concern, and suddenly you're the problem. You're accused of being selfish for even having needs. You're told you're too demanding, too emotional, too sensitive. Gradually, esteem. Your confidence in your own emotional legitimacy starts to erode, and the loneliness in this dynamic is profound. Because technically, you're not alone. You're in a relationship, esteem, but emotionally you feel unseen, unmet, unknown. You might even start longing for the early days when at least their attention felt intoxicating, not realizing that even then, esteem, it was never truly about you. It was about how you made them feel. A healthy partner is curious about you. They ask follow-up questions. They remember details. Esteem. They celebrate your growth even when it doesn't benefit them. They make space for your inner world. Esteem. If you find yourself consistently feeling like a supporting character in your own relationship, if your needs feel like inconveniences, esteem. If conversations leave you drained rather than connected, that's not partnership. That's orbiting someone else's ego. And love is not supposed to feel like disappearing. Esteem. Now, once you've experienced the intensity, and once you've begun to feel that subtle erasure where everything revolves around them, the next shift is even more destabilizing. Esteem. This is where you stop just feeling unseen, and you start feeling confused. Gaslighting doesn't usually begin with something dramatic. It starts small. Esteem. You bring up something they said last week, a promise, a comment, a criticism, and they look at you calmly and say, "I never said that." And you pause. Because you're pretty sure they did. Esteem. You remember where you were sitting, you remember how it felt. But they're so certain, so composed, so dismissive. And now you're doubting yourself. Esteem. Gaslighting is psychological manipulation designed to make you question your memory, your perception, and eventually your sanity. It's not just disagreement, it's systematic distortion. Esteem. You might hear things like, "You're too sensitive, you're overreacting. You're imagining things." That never happened. Over time, those phrases become internalized. Esteem. You start editing your reactions before you even express them. You think, maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe this is my fault. Notice what's happening here. Earlier, esteem, the relationship revolved around them. Now your very sense of reality begins to revolve around them too. Their version of events becomes the dominant narrative. In healthy conflict, esteem. Two people can remember the same event differently and still respect each other's experiences. But gaslighting isn't about perspective. It's about control. Esteem. It's about destabilizing you enough that you stop trusting your own internal compass. And when you don't trust your compass, you start relying on theirs. This often escalates gradually. Esteem, first it's denial, then it's minimization. It wasn't that big of a deal. Then it's reversal. Actually, esteem, you're the one who did that. Suddenly you're defending yourself instead of addressing the original issue. Have you ever walked into a conversation knowing exactly what you wanted to say, esteem, and somehow walked out apologizing. That's not random, that's the power of narrative manipulation. And here's why this is so psychologically powerful. Humans need coherence, esteem. We need our memories and experiences to make sense. When someone repeatedly contradicts your lived experience, your brain scrambles to resolve the dissonance, esteem. Since it's painful to believe your partner is manipulating you, it often feels easier to assume you're mistaken. Over time, this creates hypervigilance. You replay conversations in your head, esteem. You screenshot messages. You mentally document details just to reassure yourself you're not crazy. That word, crazy, often enters the dynamic. Either they imply it or you begin fearing it, esteem. And the more you doubt yourself, the less likely you are to challenge them. That's the goal, esteem. A partner who questions themselves is easier to control than a partner who stands firmly in their perception. Gaslighting also isolates you internally. Even if you have supportive friends, esteem. You may hesitate to share what's happening because it sounds confusing. It's hard to explain subtle reality distortions. You might think, maybe I'm exaggerating. So you keep it to yourself, esteem. And now you're not just orbiting their ego, you're losing your psychological footing. What makes this especially painful is that you may still remember the early intensity, esteem, the way they once made you feel special. So when they deny or distort, you try even harder to communicate clearly. You believe if you just explain it better, they'll understand, esteem. But understanding isn't the issue, control is. A partner who consistently reframes your experience, dismisses your emotional truth, or rewrites history is not confused, esteem. They are protecting their self-image at your expense, and the long-term impact is significant. Chronic gaslighting can lead to anxiety, depression, self-doubt, esteem, and a fractured sense of identity. You may stop trusting your decisions. You may seek constant reassurance. You may feel smaller, quieter, less certain in every area of life, esteem. Not just the relationship. Healthy love strengthens your sense of self. It doesn't erode it. If you find yourself constantly questioning what you saw, what you heard, what you felt, esteem, if you feel like reality shifts depending on their mood, that is not miscommunication. That is manipulation. And when someone makes you doubt your own mind, they are not loving you, esteem. They are controlling you. After the confusion sets in, after you've started questioning your own memory and shrinking your own voice, something else becomes painfully clear, esteem. There is no accountability. None. Without accountability, there is no real relationship. There is only control. In healthy partnerships, conflict is uncomfortable but productive. I'm sorry. Someone reflects, someone adjusts. There's repair. But in narcissistic dynamics, esteem, repair is almost impossible because admitting fault threatens their entire self-concept. When you bring up something that hurt you, watch what happens, esteem. Do they pause and consider your feelings? Or do they immediately defend, deflect, or counterattack? You might hear, esteem, I wouldn't have said that if you hadn't, or you're twisting my words, or why are you always attacking me? Suddenly, the conversation about their behavior becomes a trial about yours, esteem. Blame shifting is one of the most consistent patterns here. The responsibility never lands on them. If they forgot something important, it's because you didn't remind them properly, esteem. If they lashed out, it's because you provoked them. If they betrayed your trust, it's because you weren't attentive enough. There is always a reason, and the reason is almost always you, esteem. Over time, this creates a strange emotional trap. You begin overanalyzing your own behavior constantly, esteem. Maybe I could have said that differently. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. You take on more and more responsibility in hopes of stabilizing the relationship. But here's the truth, esteem. You cannot fix a dynamic where one person refuses to own their impact. And sometimes they do apologize, but notice the quality of it. Is it, I'm sorry you feel that way, esteem? That's not an apology, that's a dismissal. Is it followed by change, or does the same behavior repeat next week? Real accountability includes behavioral shift, esteem. Words without change are just maintenance tactics. Another pattern you may notice is victim reversal. You raise a concern, and within minutes, they're the wounded one, esteem. They talk about how hard this is for them, how criticized they feel, how no one appreciates them. And because you're empathetic, you pivot. You start comforting the very person who hurt you, esteem. Now you're not just unheard, you're responsible for soothing them after they've harmed you. This dynamic can make you feel cruel for even bringing up issues. You might think, esteem, why do I always create conflict? But asking for respect, clarity, or repair is not conflict creation, it's relationship maintenance. In a balanced partnership, esteem, both people take turns being accountable. In a narcissistic one, accountability feels like a one-way street. There's also a subtle rewriting of history around mistakes, esteem. They may minimize past incidents. That was months ago. Why are you still stuck on it? Or they'll exaggerate their own growth without demonstrating it, esteem. I've changed so much, even though the same patterns continue. The narrative becomes more important than the behavior. And here's the emotional cost when someone never admits fault, esteem. You start absorbing fault that isn't yours. You become heavier, more self-critical, less certain. You may even start apologizing preemptively just to avoid escalation, esteem. The absence of accountability also prevents intimacy, because intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires saying, I messed up. If one person cannot tolerate imperfection in themselves, esteem, then the relationship becomes built on illusion, not honesty. And you feel it. You feel the imbalance, you feel the injustice. But by now you may also feel exhausted, esteem, tired of fighting for basic acknowledgement, tired of conversations that go nowhere, tired of being the only one who reflects, grows, adjusts. Healthy love includes humility, esteem. It includes repair. It includes mutual responsibility for the emotional climate of the relationship. When that's missing, what you're left with is performance, esteem. A relationship that looks intact on the surface but is fractured underneath. If you're the only one doing the apologizing, the reflecting, the changing, that's not partnership, esteem. That's emotional labor without reciprocity, and love cannot survive where accountability does not exist. Now, by this point in the relationship, you're likely exhausted, esteem. You've experienced the intensity, the self-centeredness, the gaslighting, the complete absence of accountability. And yet, you're still there. And that's the part many people don't understand, esteem. They think if it's so bad, why don't you just leave? Because it's not always bad, and that's exactly the problem, esteem. One of the most powerful dynamics in narcissistic relationships is the cycle of idealization and devaluation. It doesn't stay dark all the time, it swings. One day you're adored again, esteem. The warmth returns. The compliments come back, they look at you the way they did in the beginning. And just when you're about to detach emotionally, they pull you back in, esteem. This cycle is not random, it's psychologically conditioning. During the idealization phase, you feel safe, special, chosen again. You think, maybe things are changing. You start to relax, esteem. You begin to believe the worst is behind you. They may even acknowledge small pieces of conflict, just enough to give you hope. The relationship feels almost normal. And then something shifts, esteem. A criticism, a cold withdrawal. A sudden mood change, you say something neutral, and it's interpreted as an attack. You make a small mistake, and it becomes proof that you're flawed, esteem. The pedestal you were placed on earlier. Now you've fallen off it. The devaluation can be subtle or severe. Sometimes it's sarcasm. Sometimes it's silent treatment, esteem. Sometimes it's open contempt. They compare you to others. They highlight your weaknesses. They make you feel inadequate in ways that cut deeper than you expect, esteem. And because you've tasted the good version of them, you start chasing it. This is where trauma bonding forms. Trauma bonds are built through intermittent reinforcement, esteem, unpredictable rewards. It's the same psychological mechanism that keeps people hooked on slot machines. You never know when the affection will return, so you stay invested, esteem, hoping the next moment will be the good one. Your nervous system becomes addicted to relief. Not happiness, relief. The relief when they're kind again. The relief when the tension lifts, esteem. The relief when they text sweetly after days of distance. You begin organizing your behavior around preventing devaluation. You become hyper, attuned to their moods. You monitor your tone, esteem. You anticipate triggers. You walk on eggshells not because you're weak, but because you're trying to stabilize something inherently unstable. And here's the heartbreaking part, esteem. You often blame yourself for the shifts. If I hadn't said that, if I were more supportive, if I were more patient, you believe that if you can just perfect yourself, esteem, you can secure the idealization permanently. But the cycle isn't about your performance, it's about their regulation. Narcissistic dynamics require constant validation, esteem. When you're providing admiration and compliance, you're idealized. When you assert needs, show imperfection, or simply exist as a separate human being, devaluation begins, esteem. It's not personal in the way it feels, it's structural, and yet it feels deeply personal. Because you remember the beginning. You remember how intensely you were valued, esteem. So every time you're devalued, it feels like a verdict on your worth. The emotional whiplash is destabilizing. One week you feel deeply connected. The next you feel discarded, esteem. And just when you start building emotional distance, the warmth returns, restarting the cycle. This unpredictability creates confusion and hope at the same time, and hope can be very powerful, esteem. You don't leave because you're waiting for consistency. You're waiting for the loving version to stay. But here's what I want you to understand in healthy love. Affection is steady, esteem. Respect is consistent. You are not cycling between being treasured and being torn down, esteem. If you find yourself constantly trying to get back to the good phase, if your relationship feels like emotional weather patterns you can't predict, esteem. If you feel addicted to the moments of relief between storms, that's not passion. That's conditioning. And love should never feel like surviving the next emotional swing, esteem. And after all of this, the intensity, the erasure, the confusion, the blame shifting, the emotional whiplash, we arrive at something even more constricting. Control, not always loud, esteem, not always obvious, but steady, incremental, strategic. Control in narcissistic relationships rarely begins as domination, it begins as concern. Why are you going out again, esteem? I just don't like that friend, they're a bad influence. I worry about you when you wear that. I just want us to spend all our time together. At first, it sounds protective, attentive, esteem, loving even. And because the relationship has already conditioned you to value their approval, you may interpret these comments as care. But slowly, your world begins to shrink, esteem. You see certain friends less because it creates tension. You stop sharing certain opinions because it leads to arguments. You adjust how you dress, how you speak, how you post online, esteem, not because you want to, but because it's easier than dealing with the fallout. Isolation doesn't always look like being locked away. It looks like gradual disconnection, esteem. You might cancel plans more often. You might avoid confiding in family because you're tired of defending your partner, esteem. You might feel embarrassed explaining the emotional chaos to people who love you. So you say less, you withdraw quietly. And here's the critical piece: the smaller your support system becomes, esteem, the more dependent you become on the relationship. Control also shows up in subtle power moves, financial decisions made without you, silent treatment used as punishment, esteem, withholding affection to teach you a lesson, monitoring your whereabouts, questioning your loyalty in ways that feel accusatory rather than curious. Over time, esteem, you begin anticipating their reactions before making decisions. Will this upset them? Becomes the filter through which you live. That's not love. That's surveillance, esteem. And what makes this especially confusing is that it's often inconsistent. Remember the cycles we talked about. During the idealization phase, they may encourage your independence, esteem, but only when it doesn't threaten their dominance. The moment you assert autonomy in a way that challenges their control, the tone shifts. If you gain confidence, they may criticize you, esteem. If you succeed, they may subtly undermine you. If you reconnect with friends, they may create drama. Growth becomes destabilizing to them because growth makes you less controllable, esteem, and control thrives on insecurity. When someone has already eroded your trust in your own perception, when they've convinced you that you're too sensitive or too flawed, esteem, you're more likely to accept restrictions as reasonable. You may even believe you need their guidance. That's how power consolidates in the relationship, esteem. You might notice you hesitate before expressing disagreement. You might feel anxiety when your phone buzzes. You might check in excessively to avoid suspicion, esteem. You might feel guilt for wanting time alone. These are not signs of devotion. These are signs of fear-based adaptation. Healthy love expands your world. It supports your friendships, esteem. It encourages your independence. It celebrates your individuality. It does not require you to become smaller to keep the peace. And here's the paradox, esteem. The more you shrink to maintain the relationship, the less of you is left inside it. Control can become so normalized that you don't even see it clearly anymore. You just feel tired, esteem, constrained, less vibrant than you used to be. You may look back at who you were before the relationship and barely recognize that version of yourself. That's not coincidence. That's erosion, esteem. When someone needs to monitor, limit, isolate, or intimidate in order to feel secure, that is not intimacy. That is insecurity weaponized, esteem. And if you find yourself living in a smaller emotional and social space than you once did, if you feel like your independence has been negotiated away piece by piece, that's not compromise, esteem. That's control. And love should never cost you your freedom.